An enigmatic bridesmaid, a millionaire with a guided heart, and a wedding that sparks an unrelenting curiosity. Ellie and Nick's story begins in chaos but unravels into something much deeper. Before we begin the story, comment below what the country you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone! The grand estate in Napa Valley was bathed in golden light, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the sprawling vineyard. Inside the main hall, guests whispered and shifted in their seats, the soft rustle of silk and murmurs of impatience filling the air. Nick Blake stood up near the altar, his sharp black tuxedo fitting him perfectly, but his expression was anything but composed. Today was his best friend's wedding day. "Where is she?" Nick muttered under his breath, glancing at his watch for what felt like the 100th time. His brow furrowed as he leaned closer to the bride, who stood poised and radiant in her lace gown, the sunlight streaming through the arched windows. "Everyone's waiting," Nick said, his voice low but laced with urgency. The bride, exuding patience despite her own nerves, leaned towards him with a whispered explanation. "Her car broke down on the way. She called. She's almost here. Just stall a little longer." Nick sighed, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "Stall? This isn't a board meeting. It's a wedding. People expect the ceremony to start on time." "She'll make it," the bride said with a confident smile, through her fingers clenched her bouquet tightly. Before Nick could respond, a loud creak echoed through the hall as a massive double doors in the back of the room slowly opened. All heads turned as a disheveled yet breathtaking woman stood in the doorway. Her cheeks were flushed from exertion, her breathing labored. Ellie Bennett, the missing bridesmaid, had finally arrived. Her long dress was slightly wrinkled, the hem damp and trailing behind her, evidence of her rushed journey. One of her glittery silver heels was visibly scuffed, and the other looked mismatched. Sorry, she whispered, hurrying down the aisle, clutching her bouquet with one hand and holding the train of her dress with the other. Loose strands of dark hair framed her face, her half-pinned, elegant hairstyle slightly undone. Despite her frazzled appearance, she carried herself with undeniable grace, quiet confidence emanating from her every step. Nick's gaze locked onto her, his irritation melting away. She reached the altar, mouthing an apology to the bride, who gave her an understanding nod. Nick, however, couldn't take his eyes off of her. "Glad you can join us," he murmured, his tone hovering between sarcasm and amusement. Ellie glanced at him, her hazel eyes flashing with embarrassment and determination. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied, her voice steady despite her frazzled appearance. As the ceremony began, Nick found himself distracted. Who is she? Nick wondered. The mismatched shoes, the slightly smudged eyeliner that only added to her charm, and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, it all intrigued him. He stole glances at Ellie. She stood tall and composed now, the chaos of her arrival seemingly forgotten. Her fingers gripped the bouquet tightly, but her expression softened as she watched the bride and groom exchange vows. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and applause erupted as the bride and groom kissed. Yet for Nick, the ceremony passed in a blur, his thoughts tethered to the enigmatic bridesmaids who had swept into the hall like a whirlwind and effortlessly captured his attention. As guests filed out for the reception, Nick lingered near the altar, watching Ellie walk toward the exit with the other bridesmaids. "Nick, you coming?" the groom called, clapping him on the shoulder. Snapping out of his thoughts, Nick plastered on a polite smile. "Yeah, I'll be right there." But as the groom walked away, Nick remained rooted in place, his gaze following Ellie as she disappeared through the door. For the first time in years, Nick felt a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with business. He had to know more about her, about the bridesmaid who had turned his world upside down in mere moments. The golden glow of string lights cast a warm hue over the vineyard reception, where laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Nick stood by the bar, his glass of champagne untouched, scanning the crowd. It didn't take long to spot her. Ellie stood near the edge of the dance floor, speaking with other bridesmaids. Her soft laugh carried over the music, infectious and disarming. Nick set down his glass and strode towards her, his signature confidence propelling him forward. When Ellie glanced up, her hazel eyes met his. "You certainly know how to make an entrance," Nick teased, his voice warm. Ellie's lips curved into a nervous smile. "Not my best moment," she admitted. "But at least I made it in time." "Barely," Nick quipped, his grin disarming. "If you hadn't, I'm sure the bride would have found a way to drag you down the aisle herself." Ellie laughed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "She might have tried. I wouldn't blame her. It's her big day." Nick tilted his head, studying her closely. "So, why were you late on your wedding day?" Ellie hesitated for a beat, her smile faltering before recovering. "Let's just say it involved a flat tire, bad timing, and a lot of running in heels." Nick chuckled. "Oh, well, sounds like a story worth hearing. Maybe over a dance?" Ellie glanced at the dance floor where couples swayed in a soft jazz melody. "I don't know," she began, but Nick extended his hand, his expressions playful yet insistent. "Come on," he said. "You owe me for making us wait at the altar." Ellie rolled her eyes, but placed her hand in his. "Fine, but don't expect me to be any good at this. I'm more of a spectator than a dancer." "We'll take it slow," Nick promised, leading her onto the floor. As they began to move, Ellie's initial awkwardness melted away. Nick's steady hand guided her effortlessly, his charm putting her at ease. "Not bad," he said, a smirk tugging at his lips. "For a self-proclaimed spectator." Ellie laughed softly. "You're not so bad yourself. I'm guessing you've done this before." "Once or twice," Nick admitted. "But I don't think I've ever had such a captivating partner." Ellie looked away, her cheeks tinged with color. "You're good at this," she said. "At dancing?" "No," she replied, meeting his gaze. "At making people feel comfortable, even when they're completely out of their element." Nick's smirk softened into a genuine smile. Their conversation flowed as easily as their movements, their banter laced with warmth and curiosity. Nick found himself drawn to her honesty and quick wit, while Ellie couldn't help but to be intrigued by his easygoing demeanor. "So, what do you do, Ellie?" Nick asked as the song shifted into a slower melody. Ellie's smile faltered briefly. "I work at an art gallery," she said carefully, "mostly behind the scenes." "That sounds fascinating," Nick said. "Which one? Maybe I've been there." "It's small," Ellie replied quickly, avoiding his eyes. "Not the kind of place that gets lots of foot traffic." Nick raised an eyebrow at her vague answer, but decided not to press her. "I'd still love to see it sometime," he said. Ellie gave him a polite smile. "Maybe." As the dance ended, Nick escorted her off the floor, reluctant to let the conversation end. But as they neared the edge of the crowd, a photographer appeared, aiming their camera toward the dance floor. Ellie tensed visibly, turning her head away from the lens. "Everything okay?" Nick asked, noticing the shift in her demeanor. "I'm fine," Ellie said quickly. "I just don't like having my picture taken." Nick nodded, though her reaction puzzled him. "Fair enough. No photos, then." Not long after, Ellie glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should go," she said, her tone reluctant. "Already?" Nick asked, disappointment flickering across his face. "It's getting late," Ellie replied, "and I have an early morning tomorrow." "Let me walk you out," Nick offered. Ellie hesitated but nodded. "All right." As they walked toward the parking area, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ellie than she was letting on. Her easy laugh, her sharp mind, and even her reluctance to share personal details all painted a picture of someone who carried secrets she wasn't ready to reveal. When they reached her car, a modest sedan with a slightly dented bumper, Ellie turned to face him. "Thanks for the dance, Nick," she said warmly. "Thanks for letting me drag you onto the dance floor," Nick replied, his grin returning. "But I have a feeling I'll be seeing you again." Ellie's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "We'll see," she said, slipping into her car. Nick watched as she drove off, her taillights fading into the distance. His chest tightened with a mix of frustration and intrigue. He didn't know much about Ellie Bennett, but one thing was clear. He wasn't ready to let this mystery go. The morning after the wedding, Nick Blake found himself distracted, sitting in his sleek corner office with a floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown. He tried to focus on the endless emails demanding his attention. But his mind kept drifting back to Ellie Bennett, the mysterious bridesmaid who had left as quickly as she had arrived. By mid-morning, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up his phone and called the bride. "Nick!" her voice chirped on the other end. "What can I do for you?" "I have a question," Nick said, trying to sound casual. "Your bridesmaid, Ellie, what's her story?" The bride hesitated, her tone turning cautious. "Ellie is a private person, Nick. She doesn't talk much about her life, especially her family. I'll just say she's been through a lot and likes to keep her distance." "Distance, huh?" Nick mused. "Well, she's not making it easy for someone to get to know her." "Maybe that's the point," the bride said with a light laugh. "But if anyone can break through, it's you. Just be gentle. She's not like the women you're used to." With his connections, Nick quickly found out Ellie's workplace and home address. That afternoon, he walked through its doors, the bells above tinkling softly. The gallery was bright and airy, its walls lined with abstract paintings, modern sculptures, and photographs that seemed to capture fleeting moments. In the center of the room, Ellie was busy with a stack of picture frames. Her hair was loosely tied into a ponytail, and she wore a simple shirt and jeans, completely different from the elegance she had exuded at the wedding. Yet, to Nick, she was just as captivating as before. Ellie looked up, surprise evident on her face. "Nick," she said, straightening up, "what are you doing here?" "You disappeared before I can ask you for a second dance," he said smoothly, his grin playful. Ellie crossed her arms, arching an eyebrow. "And you tracked me down for that? Persistent, aren't you?" "You left me no choice," Nick said lightly. "Besides, I was curious. You're full of surprises, Ellie Bennett." Ellie sighed, though she didn't seem entirely upset by his presence. "So, now you've satisfied your curiosity, you can leave." Nick's grin widened. "Not quite. How about coffee? Unless you're planning to run away again." Ellie hesitated, glancing at the clock. She was about to decline when Nick added, "Just one coffee. You can even pick the place." Her lips twitched, perhaps a hint of a smile. "Fine, one coffee." They ended up at a cozy cafe a few blocks away. Nick held the door open for Ellie, who ordered tea, while he opted for black coffee. They found a table by the window, the afternoon sunlight streaming in. "So," Nick began, leaning back in his chair, "tell me about your art. Working at the gallery must be inspiring." Ellie nodded, her hands wrapped around her mug. "I love it. I've always been drawn to art, how it can say things words can't. I used to paint a lot when I was younger." "Why'd you stop?" Nick asked, his genuine interest catching her off guard. Ellie hesitated, her gaze dropping to her tea. "Life got complicated," she said simply. "Sometimes you have to put dreams on hold." Sensing she didn't want to elaborate, Nick shifted the conversation. "Do you ever think about picking it up again? Painting, I mean." "Maybe," Ellie said softly, a wistful look in her eyes. "But it's hard to find the time. Sometimes you have to make times for the things that matter," Nick said, his voice low but steady. Ellie looked at him, her guarded expression softening for a moment. "That's easy for you to say," she replied, though there was no malice in her tone. Nick smiled. "Not as hard as you think." As they talked, Ellie found herself laughing at Nick's stories, his mishaps as a young entrepreneur, the time he accidentally crashed a golf cart at a charity event, and his struggle to keep a houseplant alive despite his best efforts. "You're not what I expected," Ellie admitted, surprising herself with the confusion. "What'd you expect?" Nick asked, leaning forward. "Someone different," she said vaguely, her smile fading as her phone buzzed on the table. Ellie glanced at the screen, her face paling slightly as she read a message from a journalist. Nick noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" he asked. Ellie quickly put the phone down, forcing a tight smile. "It's nothing, just work." But Nick wasn't convinced. Ellie stood, grabbing her purse. "I should get back. Thanks for the coffee." Nick stood as well, watching her closely. "You're not running away again, are you?" he teased lightly, though his concern was evident. Ellie's smile was faint, almost apologetic. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, Nick, she said before turning and walking out of the cafe. Nick sat back down, staring out at the window as Ellie disappeared down the street. Her words lingered in his mind, only strengthening his resolve. He didn't know what she was hiding, but one thing was clear. He wasn't ready to give up on Ellie Bennett. Not yet. The following week, Nick couldn't shake the feeling there was more to Ellie than she had let on. Her evasiveness, the cryptic phone message, and her reluctance to talk about herself all pointed to a deeper story. The answers came unexpectedly during a lunch meeting with Mark Caldwell, a venture capitalist known for his encyclopedic knowledge of high society. "You've been distracted all lunch," Mark said with a grin. "What's on your mind? A new deal? Or is it a girl?" Nick smirked. "Maybe both. What do you know about Ellie Bennett?" Mark's expression shifted, his brow furrowing. "Bennett? Are we talking about Henry Bennett's daughter?" Nick froze. "What do you mean?" Mark leaned in, lowering his voice. "Henry Bennett was one of the biggest names in finance a decade ago. Then the scandal hit. Fraud, insider trading, the works. His empire crumbled overnight. His daughter, Ellie, vanished from the public eye. Haven't heard her name in years." Nick processed the information, a mix of surprise and concern flooding his thoughts. "And she's been off the radar since, then?" "As far as I know," Mark said. "If she's resurfaced, it's news to me. What's your connection to her?" Nick didn't answer, his thoughts racing. Later that evening, Nick stood outside the gallery, the sun setting behind him as he waited for Ellie. When she stepped out, locking the door behind her, she started in surprise at the sight of him. "Nick," she said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. Ellie's eyes flickered with apprehension, but she nodded. "All right, let's walk." They strolled down the quiet street, the city's evening bustle humming in the background. Nick didn't waste time. "I know who you are, Ellie," he began, watching her reaction closely, her steps faltering for a moment before continuing. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice strained. "Henry Bennett," Nick said gently. "Your father." Ellie stopped abruptly, turning to face him, her expressions a mix of fear and defiance. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nick asked, his tone less accusatory and more searching. "Were you ever going to?" "Because it doesn't matter," Ellie replied, her voice shaking. "I'm not that person anymore." They found a bench near a small park and sat in tense silence before Ellie finally spoke. "Everything changed when my father's world fell apart," she said quietly. "I was just out of college, trying to figure who I was. Then the scandal broke. Headlines, paparazzi accusations, everywhere. I was just out of college, trying to figure out who I was. Then the scandal broke. Headlines, paparazzi, accusations everywhere. My father dragged all of us down with him." Nick listened intently, his gaze fixed on her as she continued. "My mother left, my friends disappeared, and suddenly I was the daughter of a criminal. People only saw the name Bennett, not me." Her voice thickened with emotion. "I couldn't escape it, so I left. I changed everything, my city, my job, my life. I wanted to rebuild, to be someone more than just his shadow." "Why the gallery?" Nick asked softly. "Because it's quiet," Ellie replied. "Because no one asks questions, like I can just exist without judgment." Nick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I get why you'd want to leave all of that behind," he said. "But why not tell me? I wouldn't have judged you." Ellie looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Because I didn't want you to see me differently. The moment people know, it changes everything. They either pity me or use me. I didn't want that with you." Her vulnerability struck Nick deeply. He reached out, taking her hand. "Ellie, I don't care about your name or your past. I care about you, the person sitting right here." Ellie's lips quivered, and for a moment the walls she had built around herself seemed to begin crumbling. Before either could say more, a sudden flash startled them. Nick turned to see a man with a camera across the street, snapping photos furiously. Who's that? Ellie asked, her voice rising in panic. Journalist, Nick said grimly, standing and shielding her from the lens. Stay here. He crossed the street quickly, but the photographer darted into an alley, disappearing before Nick could reach him. When Nick returned, Ellie was visibly shaken. He knows, she whispered, panic lacing her voice. It's all going to come out now. Let me handle this, Nick said firmly. I won't let them hurt you. Ellie shook her head, stepping back. You don't understand. They'll dig up everything. My father, my family, my life, and now you're part of it. So what? Nick countered. Let them talk. It doesn't change how I feel about you. But Ellie was already retreating, her face pale. I can't do this, Nick, she said, her voice breaking. I can't drag you into my mess. She turned and walked away, leaving Nick standing alone into the fading light, the weight of her words pressing heavily on his heart. The next morning was chaotic. Nick arrived at his office to find a stack of newspapers and a barrage of emails from his PR team. Headlines splashed across every screen read, Millionaire love affair with fallen heiress. Nick Blake and Ellie Bennett's secret past exposed. Nick scanned the article, his jaw tightening with each word. The piece painted Ellie as a manipulative social climber, desperate to use Nick's success to claw her way back into high society. There were photos from the park, accompanied by speculative commentary about the relationship. By mid-morning, the scandal had reached his boardroom. His business partners gathered for an emergency meeting, their concern evident. Nick, this isn't just about you, one of them said. Our company's reputation is on the line. Clients are asking questions, another chimed in. You have to distance yourself from her. We can't afford this kind of distraction right now. Nick stood at the head of the table, his expressions calm but firm. This is my personal life, he said evenly. It doesn't affect how I run this company. Perception is reality, another partner countered. And right now, the perception isn't good. That evening, Nick arrived at Ellie's apartment, determined to reassure her. When she opened the door, he immediately noticed the packed suitcase near the couch. What's going on? He asked, his voice laced with concern. Ellie looked at him, her eyes heavy with regret. I'm leaving, Nick. This has gone too far. Leaving? Nick stepped inside, disbelief evident in his tone. You're letting some tabloid dictate your life? This isn't about me, Ellie snapped, her voice breaking. Look at what this is doing to you, your business, your reputation. You don't deserve this kind of fallout. Nick closed the gap between them, his tone softening. Ellie, I don't care about the headlines or what people think. What we have is real. Don't let them take that away from us. Ellie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. You don't understand. I've been here before, watching everything crumble because of my name. I won't let that happen to you. You're not your father, Nick said firmly. And you're not alone anymore. We can face this together. Ellie looked away, her shoulders trembling. I can't risk it, Nick. It's better if I walk away. Her words hit him like a blow. Ellie, please. I'm sorry, she whispered, stepping back, but this is the only way. Nick watched helplessly as Ellie grabbed her suitcase and slipped out the door. The sound of it closing behind her was deafening. For days, Nick buried himself in work, trying to distract himself from the ache Ellie's absence had left behind. But no matter how busy he kept himself, her voice, her laugh, her presence haunted him. Late one night, he sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline. The scandal had already begun to die down. The headlines replaced by fresher gossip, yet the damage to his heart remained. He thought about what his partners had said about his perception and reputation, but none of it mattered, not compared to what he found with Ellie. She had brought something into his life that he hadn't realized he was missing. Authenticity, warmth, and a sense of purpose beyond success and wealth. Nick picked up his phone and made a call. The next morning, Nick met Ellie's best friend. I need your help, he said simply. She smiled knowingly. I was wondering how long it would take. Do you know where she is? Nick asked, hope flickering in his voice. She mentioned going back to her hometown. There's an old art studio there where she used to paint. If she's anywhere, it's probably there. Nick nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes. Thank you. The small town was a stark contrast to his usual surroundings. As he drove through its quiet streets, he felt a strange mix of nerves and determination. He found the art studio easily, a modest, weathered building with a large window that let in natural light. Through the glass, he spotted her. Ellie was seated at an easel, her back to him, her brush moving across the canvas in deliberate strokes. For a moment, Nick just watched, his heart swelling at the sight of her doing something she clearly loved. Finally, he stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Ellie turned, her eyes widening in shock. Nick, she said, standing, what are you doing here? I came to bring you back, he said simply. Ellie frowned, crossing her arms. I told you, Nick, this isn't going to work. Nick closed the distance between them. You're wrong, Ellie. It already works. It works because I don't care about your past, or the headlines, or what anyone else thinks. I care about you. Ellie's resolve faltered as she looked into his eyes. Nick, you can't run forever, Nick said gently. And I'm not going anywhere, so you might as well stop running. Tears welled in Ellie's eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. Okay, she whispered. Nick smiled, pulling her into his arms. Okay, he echoed. Together they stood in the quiet studio, a sense of peace settling over them as they embraced the second chance they both deserved. The gallery hummed with quiet energy as guests wandered through, admiring the carefully curated exhibit. Each piece was tied together by a theme of resilience, growth, and transformation. At the center of the exhibit was the highlight of the evening, a striking painting of a woman standing tall against a stormy backdrop, her eyes fierce and unyielding. Ellie stood near the entrance, watching as visitors marveled at the artwork. She had no idea who the artist was or how the piece had come to the gallery, but something about it felt deeply personal. The gallery owner approached her with a knowing smile. There's someone here who'd like to speak with you, he said, nodding toward the far end of the room. Ellie turned, her breath catching as she saw Nick standing there in a tailored suit, his hands clasped in front of him. Nick, she said, walking towards him, what are you doing here? Nick smiled warmly. You didn't think I'd let you have an exhibit like this without being part of it, did you? Ellie tilted her head, confused. What do you mean? Nick gestured toward the centerpiece painting. That's yours. I commissioned it for you. Ellie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling up as she looked at the painting again. You did this for me? Every brushstroke, Nick said softly, was meant to show you how I see you, strong, beautiful, and capable of standing through any storm. As the room quieted, Nick turned to address the guest. Thank you all for coming tonight, he began, his voice carrying across the gallery. This exhibit is about the resilience and the power to redeem yourself, no matter where you've come from or what you've been through. His eyes found Ellie's, and he continued, Ellie Bennett has spent so long hiding who she is, but to me, she's perfect just as she is. Her past doesn't define her. Her heart, her courage, and her talent do. And I've been lucky enough to see that firsthand. Ellie's tears spilled over as Nick stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I don't care about your name or your past, Ellie. I care about you. I always have, and I always will. Ellie's heart swelled as she searched his face, finding nothing but sincerity and love. You didn't just see me, Nick, she whispered. You believed in me, and that means everything. The room erupted in applause as Nick took her hand, leading her to the center of the gallery. Months later, Nick stood on the sprawling estate in Napa Valley, the same one where they had first met. Friends and family gathered under a canopy of twinkling lights as the sun set over the vineyards. Nick took Ellie's hand, his eyes never leaving hers as he spoke. Ellie, from the moment you burst through those doors, late and flustered, you turned my life upside down. I didn't know then how much you'd come to mean to me, but now I can't imagine my life without you. Will you let me spend the rest of it making you happy? Ellie smiled through her tears. Yes, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. 1,000 times, yes. Their wedding day was a celebration of love, resilience, and second chances. The ceremony was intimate, filled with laughter, heartfelt speeches, and the warmth of a close-knit group of loved ones. As they shared their first dance under a canopy of string lights, Ellie rested her head against Nick's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Thank you for chasing me," she whispered. Nick smiled, his arms tightening around her. "It was the easiest decision I ever made." The night stretched on, filled with joy and the promise of a new beginning for Nick and Ellie. It wasn't just the start of a marriage, it was the beginning of a life built on love, trust, and the belief that together they could weather any storm. As Nick and Ellie danced under the glowing lights, their story reminded everyone that love has the power to heal, transform, and bring out the best in us. From a chance meeting at a wedding to overcoming secrets and scandals, they proved that true love is worth fighting for. If this heartwarming story has touched you, don't forget to like the video and share it with those who believe in the magic of love and second chances. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the beauty found in the unexpected moments of life. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a story about love and resilience. Thank you for watching and see you in the next story.